They say I had steady hands. I've heard it said from the mouths of those who never looked me in the eye. He never flinched. They'd whisper behind walls, behind veils, behind the safety of their distance. The blade fell clean, just like his father's. And yes, my hands did not tremble, not in daylight, not in front of the crowds. Not even when the condemned sobbed or spat or begged for their mother's name. But they never asked what it cost to keep them still. The candle is almost gone now. The wax has curled into a pale lake around its base. The flame dances faintly against the stone of my chambers, shadows leaping like frightened children from one wall to the next. I don't think I'll light another. There's not much more to say. But tonight, before the sun stirs and the bells chime and the new day begins without me in it, I'd like to tell you something true, something I've never said out loud. You don't need to know my name. Names are tools like rope or steel or fire. They do their work and then break. I've had many names, most spoken in whispers or with clenched teeth. I doubt any will be carved into stone, but you may call me what they did, the executioner. I wasn't always. Once I was a boy with ink-stained fingers and more questions than bread. But time wears everything down, wood will even wonder, and I wore down into the shape they needed. The day begins soon. I feel it in my bones, in the way the wind shifts outside the shutters, in the distant clang of iron from the far side of the square. Someone is stirring coals, someone is grinding grain, someone is praying, and here I sit with the smell of iron clinging to me still. It never leaves, even after all these years. I've scrubbed my hands raw with lime and ash, soaked them in vinegar, pressed them into rosemary until the leaves turned black. But it's there, always. In the cracks of my skin, in the collar of my robe, in the crease beneath my thumb, metal, sweat, and something deeper, something that doesn't have a name. If you've ever stood beside a man and watched the color drain from his face, you might know it. If you've held your breath while others cried out, if you've walked home with the memory of a scream stitched into the lining of your coat, you might know it too. It's not guilt, not exactly. It's not fear either. It's something heavier. The kind of weight that doesn't press but seeps, slowly, until you find it sitting at the edge of your bed before sleep. Until it walks beside you through every corridor, until it becomes a scent that no amount of washing can erase. I used to think I was chosen, that perhaps this work, the breaking of bodies by law, required a particular soul, a quiet one, a steady one, someone who could measure pain in inches and time in final breaths. I believed that. For a while, now I don't think anyone is chosen. I think we're simply the ones who didn't look away fast enough. They asked me once, after a particularly grim winter, how I kept going, how I could eat stew with these hands, how I could nod to neighbors and bless the baker's wife and bow to the bishop without choking on what I'd done. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. It was simple. You stop letting yourself be a person. You become the thing they need. A tool, an office, a role in a town that wishes for justice but doesn't want to soil its own hands fetching it. And the truth is, someone has to do it. That's what they always say, isn't it? Someone has to do it. Someone has to carry the burden. Someone has to hear the verdict and carry out the sentence. Someone has to sharpen the blade, tie the knot, read the rights. And I did. Again and again and again. There is a rhythm to death if you pay attention. The way the condemned breathe, the silence just before, the last glance toward the sky or toward no one. Some curse, some weep, some go quiet as if they've already stepped into another place entirely. I never rushed them. That was my one vow. Let them have their final second, their prayer, their shame, their dignity. Let them go on their own feet if they could, not because I was kind, but because it was the only thing I could offer that wasn't taken. I've kept a ledger, not of names, but of hours. How long I sat awake after each one, how many nights I dreamed of the same face, how many times I reached for the axe in sleep, mistaking my wife's hand for something else. She's gone now, buried under the linden tree just outside the south wall. I visit her often, not to speak. I said all my words long ago. But to listen, to the birds, the wind, the creak of the branches. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I imagine she forgave me, not for what I did, but for how long I let it change me. I'm not angry if you're wondering, not bitter, not afraid of what comes next. I've made peace with the ghosts. They don't frighten me anymore. They walk the halls of this place as gently as I do. They don't whisper, they don't weep, they simply are. I used to try to forget them. Block out their faces, turn them into silhouettes, but that never worked. So instead, I remembered, I learned their names, their stories. I kept them with me like the scent on my hands. They are my truth. And now I offer that truth to you, not to seek redemption. I don't believe I'm owed it, not to explain away the things I did. No words could balance that scale, but perhaps to be known, truly, without the silence. And if you're still awake, stranger, if the candle hasn't burned down in your own room just yet, then stay a little longer. There's more I'd like to tell you. My father's hands were always stained. Not with guilt or violence, but with the honest work of a butcher, deep brown red beneath the fingernails, cracked skin from the salt brine, the faint, sweet stink of blood and fat that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. We were not poor, not exactly, but neither were we welcome at every table. People needed what we did. They needed the cuts, the curing, the carving. But they didn't like to watch. And they didn't like to look too long at those of us who could look an animal in the eye and do what needed doing. My father never minded the way people avoided him in the market square. He said it gave him more room to think. He was a quiet man, taller than most, with thick arms and a voice that only ever rose when speaking to the pigs. He taught me to sharpen a blade before I could write my name. Said a dull knife was more cruel than a sharp one, not because of what it did, but because of how long it took. We lived at the edge of the village, past the alder grove, where the wind always smelled of smoke and damp earth. The chopping block stood behind our cottage, stained dark with years of labor. I used to sit on the fence and watch my father work, his movements precise, even graceful, like a man playing a quiet instrument only he could hear. I loved him, fiercely. In the way sons often do before the world teaches them to hold their affections tighter. He wasn't affectionate, not in words, but sometimes he'd press a calloused hand to the back of my neck while we walked home from the woods, and that felt like everything. I was 12 when I first helped him bleed a goat. My hands shook. I didn't want them to, he saw it, said nothing. Instead, he showed me how to hold the legs firm, how to breathe, how to whisper, "Thank you," before the blade went in. It's a life, after all, he told me, even if it's not yours. He died in the spring. It was sudden, no illness, no signs. One morning he simply collapsed on his way to sharpen a cleaver, fell like an oak that had stood too long without showing its rot. I found him, face down, the birds still chirping overhead as if nothing had changed. He was buried 3 days later, wrapped in the same canvas he used to carry firewood. I remember the way people spoke at the funeral, softly, respectfully, but always with that curious hesitation. The sort of pause that hangs around someone who's done the things no one else dares do. And then, a week later, they came to me. First it was the reeve, then the priest, then the bailiff, quiet voices, kind expressions. Each one telling me how much the village had relied on my father, how much he had meant. How important it was to keep certain duties within trusted hands. At 16, I didn't understand what they were asking, not completely. But I understood this, someone had to do the work, and the work had come for me. At first it was just butchering again. A goat here, a boar there. People came, left their animals, took the meat, and offered coins with eyes that didn't meet mine. I cleaned the knives alone now, tended the fires, spoke to no one except the animals. Then came the cart. It arrived just before dawn, carrying a man in irons and a parchment rolled tight with the seal of the Baron. A thief, they said, a repeat offender. Caught again, this time with a blade in someone else's purse and a record long enough to shame the law. The bailiff didn't look me in the eye when he said the words. "We've no gallows this side of the forest. It must be done clean, and it must be done here." I remember staring at the parchment. the wax glinting red in the firelight. The man kneeling beside the cartwheel, wrists bound, mouth dry with fear. He looked barely older than me. I don't remember what I said. I remember sharpening the axe, the one my father had used for logs, for haunches, for the breaking of bone. I remember the sound of the stone scraping against the blade, over and over, as if each pass might make me worthy of what was coming. They built the scaffold hastily, on the green behind the chapel. A simple platform, 3 boards high, with a block in the center and 2 steps leading up. There were maybe 50 people in the square that morning. Most stood far back. A few came closer, hands folded, mouths tight. The priest mumbled a blessing. The reeve read the charges. The man, the thief, wept. He asked for nothing, not mercy, not delay, just time for a final prayer. His voice shook as he spoke it, the old Latin broken, stumbling from his lips like a child learning to walk. I stood behind him, axe in hand. The priest nodded. I raised the blade. And in that moment I stopped being a boy. The axe came down. There was silence. Not because it was clean, but because it was real. The kind of silence that wraps around your spine and holds you in place, unwilling to let you pretend you're anywhere else. I stood there, hands stained, breath held, as the blood soaked the straw beneath the block. The priest muttered a few more lines. The bailiff clapped me on the shoulder. Someone in the crowd nodded. They said I had done well, said I had my father's precision, said the man had barely felt a thing. I was praised for not trembling. They thought it meant I was strong, but no one saw my knees after. No one saw me behind the cottage, vomiting into the mud, fingers shaking so hard I dropped the blade twice before I could wash it. No one heard me whisper the same prayer the thief had tried to say. I kept the axe, not out of pride, but because I knew there would be a next time, and there was, then another. And another. I began to study, not just the edge of the blade, but the nature of the work, how to bind the hands so they didn't shake too much, how to speak gently before the end, how to look away when the light left their eyes, not out of disrespect, but to give them the dignity of dying unseen. I became the man they needed. I walked through the market and people stepped aside. I offered coins for bread and no one took them from my hand. The baker's boy once dropped a loaf rather than brush my fingers. I didn't blame them. Not then. It was easier to be feared than questioned. Easier to play the part than explain how each execution carved a new notch into something inside me. I told myself it was justice. That the law must be upheld, that I was simply the hand, not the judge. But at night, when the wind creaked the boards of the cottage and the scent of blood rose again from beneath the floorboards, I wondered. Wondered who the thief had been. Wondered if he had a mother who waited. Wondered if anyone remembered his name. I did. And that's why I never spoke it aloud. It wasn't mine to say. The strangest thing about being an executioner isn't the blood, not the blade either. You get used to those. If you can't, you don't last long. No, what stays with you is the space that opens around you like the quiet before a storm that never comes. A circle of absence that follows wherever you go. You become untouchable, not revered, not even feared really, just avoided. As if death itself lingers on your skin, and by brushing against you, someone might carry it home. That silence is heavier than any axe I've ever lifted. The days between executions are the ones no one talks about. People assume we vanish into the shadows, reappearing only when someone is sentenced, as if we sleep folded in iron coffers with the instruments of our trade. But we live among them, just slightly outside the lines. Most days began with cleaning. Blades dulled quickly, not from cutting but from time. Moisture, rust, the slow eating away of steel. I had a grindstone beneath my stairs, worn to a dip from years of sharpening. The sound of it turning was a rhythm I learned to find comfort in. I cleaned the block too, even when it wasn't used. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I couldn't stand the flies. And because I believed, perhaps foolishly, that cleanliness gave dignity to the condemned, but executions were only a part of it. Punishments came more frequently, whipping, branding, the stocks. I carried out sentences with as much care as I could. A lashing is a cruel thing, and the line between punishment and torture is as thin as thread. I counted every stroke aloud, slowly, evenly, without malice. Some would cry, some cursed. A few stared straight ahead as if already beyond pain. I never looked away. I told myself they needed someone steady, someone who would not lose control, someone who would not take pleasure. I hoped that made me kinder. Other duties came without warning, digging up bodies for the law. Burning the possessions of plague victims. Once they asked me to sever a dead nobleman's hand before burial because the priest claimed it had been used to strike a priestess. I did it. The hand was light, still wearing its ring. There was dismemberment too, rare but not unheard of, for traitors mostly, to be displayed at the gates to remind others what defiance earned. I tried not to think about what the birds did after. After a while, I learned to move at odd hours. I walked the market at dawn before the stalls were crowded. I spoke to shopkeepers from a distance, placed my coin on the table and stepped back. Some wouldn't take it until I was gone. The children stared, always the children, some in fear. Others with the strange curiosity of those who haven't yet been taught how to look away. One boy once asked me in a clear, proud voice, "Is your axe heavy?" His mother dragged him away so quickly he dropped the apple he was holding. I picked it up, took a bite, left the rest on the church steps. Ah yes, the church. That was its own kind of silence. I was allowed inside, of course. Rome made no laws against it. But when communion was passed, the priest's eyes would meet mine for just a flicker, and then move on. The body of Christ did not pass to my hands. I knelt like the others. I prayed. I stood when asked. But the wafer never touched my tongue. The wine never wet my lips. They said it was a tradition, that those who dealt death should not partake of eternal life, that God would judge me in his own time. And so I waited, every Sunday, on my knees, alone in a crowded room. Even my house was set apart, not by law but by custom. No neighbor ever built too near. My garden grew wild, full of herbs I didn't know how to cook with. The fence fell into disrepair and no one offered help. When I needed a new roof beam, I dragged it from the forest myself. Once, a traveling friar asked to stay the night. He didn't know what I was. I offered him soup, stale bread, and a bed of straw near the fire. In the morning, he blessed the room and thanked me for my kindness. Then he saw the block in the yard and the axe. He left without finishing his sentence. I used to wonder, as I laid in bed, if they ever spoke of me when I wasn't there. The villagers, I mean, did they trade stories of my father? Did they speculate on how many I'd put to death? Did they believe I slept well? I imagined them pointing at my window when their children misbehaved. Mind yourself, or the executioner will come. Perhaps I became a lesson, not a man. Have you ever served a village that pretends it doesn't know your name? Stay, and I'll show you what that silence feels like. There were rare kindnesses. A widow who left a loaf of bread on my doorstep each New Year's Eve. An old blind man who once mistook me for the carpenter and talked to me for a full hour before realizing I hadn't spoken. A little girl who offered me a yellow flower and then burst into tears when her mother screamed. I kept the flower, pressed it in a book of Psalms. It faded to brown, but never crumbled. Sometimes, late at night, I'd walk to the edge of the woods and sit beside the stream. No one followed, no one ever followed. The rush of water, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, those were the only sounds that welcomed me. There I could forget what I was. I could be a man again. A man with sore knees and aching hands and a heart that still beat, though it had no right to. Once a fox came close enough to sniff my foot. I didn't move. It looked up at me with eyes so unafraid, so unaware I nearly wept. Then it vanished into the trees. I have no children. I never dared. Who would want to marry death? Who would let it raise a child? But I have watched others grow. Watched boys become men. Watched girls blossom into mothers. I've watched from the edge of the festival square, from the back pews, from behind my shuttered window. I know their names. They don't know mine. But perhaps that's changing. Now, with this letter, with these words, I ask you to see me, not as a shadow, but as someone who stood at the line between law and mercy and tried, in his own quiet way, to hold it steady. Because sometimes the weight of that silence is heavier than any axe. No one teaches you how to look a mother in the eye after taking her child. You learn how to swing an axe. You learn the angles, the timing, how to sharpen the blade just enough to spare them the worst. You learn how to read the mood of the crowd, how to steady your breath so your hands don't shake. You learn how to bind wrists quickly, cleanly. You even learn how to speak to the condemned, what to say and when to say it. But no one teaches you how to stand still while a woman screams your name like a curse and begs you not to make her a mother of the dead. It begins small, always small. At first they're just faces in the crowd, shadows at the edge of the square. A weeping woman, a bowed head, someone crumpled near the stocks with a hand pressed to her mouth. You don't even know who they are at first. You think wife, sister, lover. You don't ask, that's not your place, but you see them. And the weight starts to gather. They come before the sentence is carried out sometimes. Bold ones, braver than most, who push through the line of guards to reach you. Their faces flushed with desperation, voices raw. He didn't do it. He's not the only one. He's only a boy. I'll take his place. Please. They all say please eventually. There's always a part of me that listens, even if I cannot act. Even if the order is written, the rope prepared, the block cleaned, I listen. I let them speak. I believe that's the last thing I can give them, even when it will never be enough. One woman clutched my robes with both fists. I still remember the strength in her hands. She was small, older than my mother would have been if she'd lived. Her son had been caught stealing grain during a poor harvest. She wept as she spoke his name again and again, like a spell that might undo the sentence. I said nothing. I never do. It would be cruel to speak false comfort. Crueler still to offer hope when none remains. She slapped me. Her palm cracked against my cheek like kindling breaking. I didn't move. She stared at me, not like I was a monster, not like I was a man, but like I was a storm, something she couldn't reason with, couldn't stop, couldn't escape. She came to the execution. Watched the whole thing, never looked away. The next day, I found an old doll left on my doorstep. I never found out who left it. I buried it in the garden. Then there was the healer's daughter. Her name was Marin. I remember because she said it, loud and clear, as she stood before me in the chapel yard the day before her brother was to die. He had been accused of plotting rebellion, writing seditious letters. I didn't know if it was true. I rarely did. But I remember her dark eyes, sharp jaw, hands that trembled not with fear but fury. She didn't plead, she didn't beg. She looked at me and spat in my face, and then she said, "When you dream, I hope you see me." I wiped my cheek, said nothing, walked away. That night I dreamed of her for the first time. Not her face, not her words, but her silence after the act. The way she stood in the square, hands clenched, eyes fixed on me as the blade fell. She didn't flinch, she didn't cry, she just stood there like a stone in the middle of a flood. I think something inside me cracked that day. After that, I started watching the women more. Not out of pity, not even guilt, but out of, I don't know, recognition maybe. A need to understand who was left behind after the work was done. I noticed how some collapsed into the arms of others, how some wailed until their voices went raw, how some wandered away alone, shoulders tight, as if afraid that letting go would let the grief spill out too loud. There was one who brought a blanket to the execution, held it in her arms the whole time. Afterwards, she laid it gently over the body before the guards could take him. I remember thinking no one should have to mother the dead, but she did. Sometimes, after a hanging, I'd pass the house of the widow left behind, hear the sound of dishes breaking, or nothing at all. Silence again, always silence. I tried once, only once, to speak to one of them after, a young woman no more than 20 whose husband had been taken in the spring. I found her sitting by the river, dipping her fingers into the current. I asked if she wanted anything, bread, coin, a prayer. She didn't look at me, just said, "He used to make boats from bark. Sent them down the stream." Then she turned and walked away. I stood there a long while, watching the river carry nothing but leaves. You begin to carry them with you, these women. Their voices, their tears, the way they hold their grief. Sometimes it folds around them like a shawl. Other times it shatters through them like glass, but always it lingers. Some days I wonder what kind of man I might have been had I never seen them. Had I turned away, shielded myself from the aftermath, would it have been easier? Perhaps, but I would have become something else entirely, something colder, something I could not forgive. I kept a bundle of tokens hidden beneath the floorboards of my room. A ribbon, a broken comb. A scrap of cloth, things dropped or left behind, not stolen, collected. Each one a reminder that my work was not just with the dying, but with the living left behind. These women, mothers, wives, sisters, they taught me the limits of duty. They taught me where mercy ends and mourning begins. And they taught me this, that grief is a soundless bell, always ringing beneath the surface of the world. Only some of us can hear it, but once you do, it never stops. Marin's face still comes to me even now, all these years later, not in anger, not in accusation, but in silence. She stands at the edge of every dream, watching, waiting, not for vengeance, just for recognition. I see you, Marin, I see all of you, and I never forgot. His name was Tomas, though I didn't know that until the night before his death. To the court, he was just a name on parchment, inked in dark, slanted letters, sealed with wax and certainty. Accused of treason, of plotting against the Baron. They said he had been caught with seditious writings, letters hidden in the lining of his cloak. But there were whispers, even then, that the charges were convenient, that someone else had much to gain by his silence. It wasn't my place to know. I wasn't a judge. I wasn't the priest. I was simply the last step in a long and careful walk. He arrived in irons like the others. Head bowed, dust on his boots. His hands were bound but not bloodied. No struggle, no pleading. Just a strange stillness, as though he were carrying something invisible that weighed more than the chains themselves. The guards pushed him into the holding cell near the chapel. I watched from the hall as they locked the door, spat at the floor, and left without another word. They always left quickly, as if the air itself had changed once the bars closed. It was a quiet day after that. No visitors, no protests. Rain tapped at the shutters. I boiled water for tea and didn't drink it. I sharpened the blade out of habit. Polished the block, though it didn't need it. And when night came, I found myself walking back to that cell without really knowing why. He was sitting on the floor when I arrived, legs crossed, palms resting on his knees like a monk at prayer. His eyes were open but unfocused, fixed on something far beyond the walls. "You've come early," he said, his voice low, almost kind. "Not for duty," I replied. He turned then, looked at me as if I were anyone else, as if I were not what I was. We stood in silence a while, the kind of silence that doesn't press but waits, patient as the sea. "I don't blame you," he said at last. I remember how his words didn't seem to belong in that space, like he had said them before, somewhere else, and only now repeated them for my sake. "You don't know me," I said. "No," he agreed, "but I've seen your eyes, and I know what it does to a man carrying out what others write down." I should have left, should have turned and walked away, but something in me rooted to the stone. He shifted slightly, just enough to rest his back against the wall. "You think I'm innocent." "I don't think anything," I answered too quickly. He smiled then, not mockingly, just gently. "Then let me help you." I blinked. "Help me?" He nodded once. "You carry weight that's not yours. You think if you don't feel it, you're a monster, but if you do, you might break. That's the tether, isn't it?" I had no words for him, only stillness. "Sit," he said, and I did. I sat just beyond the bars, with only the cold and our breaths between us. "I had a wife," he said after a time. "She died 3 winters ago. Fever, too fast, too quiet. I didn't speak for a week after." His voice was steady, no drama, just memory. "She used to tell me that forgiveness is like fire. It doesn't ask permission before it warms you. and it never chooses where to land. He looked at me again, really looked. I forgive you, he said, not because you asked, but because I can. I wanted to tell him he shouldn't, that I wasn't worthy, that I had taken too much, buried too many, stood still in the face of too much pain, but I said nothing. Because the words would not come. Instead, I wept, not loud, not shaking, just tears, quiet and unrelenting, like rain dripping through a cracked roof. He didn't move, didn't look away. When I finally spoke, it was a whisper. Why? He didn't answer right away, just closed his eyes, rested his head against the wall. Because I don't want you to become the thing they think you are, he said. Someone has to remember you're still a man. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the straw mat in my chambers, hands open, heart pounding like a drum. I thought of every face I had seen, every hand I had bound, every name I had forgotten on purpose. And then I thought of him, Tomas, the man in chains who forgave me. The next morning, I walked the path slowly. I didn't eat, didn't speak. The guards escorted him to the square. A small crowd had gathered, fewer than usual. The wind carried the scent of damp hay and old wood. The priest mumbled the rites. Tomas said nothing. When the time came, he looked at me, not with fear, not with hate, with peace. And in that final breath before the axe fell, I saw something I never expected. Mercy, true mercy. It didn't cleanse me. It didn't change what I was, but it cracked something open. A space inside me I didn't know had survived, and I've never forgotten him. Not because of how he died, but because of how he lived in those final hours. He forgave me. And I had never even asked. If you've ever been forgiven before you could admit you were wrong, you'll understand why I never forgot that man. There's a kind of death that leaves the body whole and another that tears it apart. The first is quiet, a clean cut, a measured breath. The stillness that follows a blade sharpened to its purpose. It's over in an instant if you've done it right, if the edge is true, if your hands know the way, but the other kind, that one lingers. It lingers in bones that don't break properly, in rope that burns the neck before it takes the breath, in crowds that come for justice but stay for spectacle. It lingers in screams, in gurgles, in the silence that comes too slowly, like the final word in a sentence you wish had ended long ago. I learned that the hard way. There was a man, his name was Edric, accused of arson. They said he burned his neighbor's barn in the dead of night, lit the hay with a lantern after a drunken quarrel over a stolen plow. Whether it was true, I never knew. By the time he reached the square, his fate was sealed. It was to be a hanging. Simple, standard. The gallows had been raised near the east gate where the sun catches the beams in the morning. A new rope had been ordered. The knot was tied with care. Everything was prepared. The priest said his prayer. The bailiff read the charge. Edric stood on the platform with a hood over his head, shoulders trembling, not from fear but from cold, I think. It was spring, but the wind still bit at the skin like winter's teeth. I pulled the lever, the trapdoor opened, and the rope snapped. He dropped hard, cracked against the ground. The crowd gasped. Some screamed, some laughed. He wasn't dead. He groaned, twitched, blood on his lip. One leg bent wrong. It took us too long to lift him. The replacement rope tangled. The second drop was worse, and when it was done, when his body finally hung limp, swaying slightly in the breeze, I turned from the gallows and walked straight home. I locked the door, sat by the hearth, and wept. Not because he was dead, but because I had failed him. I had believed, perhaps foolishly, that if a man must be taken, he could at least be taken with a shred of dignity, that the end didn't have to be ugly, that even the condemned deserved to die as painlessly as the law would allow. That day, I knew I could not accept the easy lie anymore. Death was not always quick, it was not always clean. And it was not always merciful, so I made a vow. If they must die, let it not be cruel. That became my religion. I began to study, quietly, carefully. I found old texts in Latin and Greek, anatomy scrolls, medical treatises, burial manuals. Anything that taught me about tendons, muscles, the points where the spine could be severed swiftly. I watched the physicians at work when they prepared bodies. Asked questions I wasn't supposed to ask, observed where the arteries pulsed strongest, where the joints hinged and the nerves ran close to the skin. I changed how I tied restraints, learned which ligatures reduced panic, which grips prevented struggling without bruising, how to set the feet to keep a man from slipping and prolonging his own agony. I carved new blocks, adjusted their height, sanded them smooth. Practiced for hours on wood, on sacks of grain, on frozen haunches. My axe became an extension of me, not just a tool, but something precise, something respectful. I stopped using the rope whenever possible. When it was ordered, I did it, but I asked questions, inspected the gallows myself, measured the drop based on weight. Replaced fraying hemp with fresh lines. No more broken necks from too short a fall. No more twitching bodies because someone wanted the rope to make a point. If they must die, let it not be cruel. Of course, no one thanked me, no one even noticed, but I noticed. There were moments, brief and strange, when the condemned would look at me, not with fear, not entirely, but with understanding, as if they knew I was trying, that I was still a man beneath the black robe. A few even nodded just before the end. One woman, her name long forgotten to the records, whispered, "Thank you," as I tied the cloth around her eyes. I don't know why, maybe because I tied it gently. I burned the robe I wore that day Edric died, the one soaked in sweat, damp with the stink of failure. I burned it behind the house, buried the ashes under a patch of nettles. I didn't want it near me. After that, I kept to simpler garments, nothing ceremonial, no symbols, no dark flourishes meant to impress the crowd or remind them of the state's power. I wore what I wore to tend my garden, neutral, plain. When I walked to the square, I did not march. I arrived, I performed my duty, and I left. A priest once asked me why I did not pray aloud before each sentence. I told him I did, just not with words. Because every measured cut, every careful knot, every silent moment of pause that was my prayer, I knew what people wanted. They wanted justice, punishment, spectacle, but I had seen too much, too many wide eyes. Too many hands bound tight, too many last breaths taken between sobs, so I made a choice. If I could not stop the death, I could at least shape it into something bearable, something that did not add to the wound. I even stopped letting the crowds gather close. I asked the guards to keep them further back, said it was for safety, said it was for law. But really, it was so the condemned could die with a sliver of privacy. The gallows may have been public, but the last breath, that belonged to them alone. Sometimes, when the day ended and the tools were cleaned, I would sit by the river with my boots off and my hands in the water. Let the current run over my palms, watch the silt drift. I imagined it carrying away something invisible. A trace of what I carried, not guilt, but memory. And for a while I would feel lighter, not cleansed, just less heavy. And that was enough to rise again the next day. So if you ask me why I studied how to cut without cruelty, why I learned the paths of nerves and bones instead of just swinging like a butcher, it's because death is already cruel. I didn't want to add to it. They say even stones can bloom if you leave them long enough in the sun. I never expected love, not the soft kind, not the quiet kind that warms you without warning, not after the years I had carried, the things I had seen. The names I had erased from this world with a blade or a knot. I didn't think I was allowed to want anything more than silence. But then I met her. Her name was Lyra. She was not the sort of woman who smiled easily. There was a weight to her posture, the kind that came from years of carrying water, lifting baskets, and folding too many linens. She had a bakery, not a grand one, just a corner oven built into the wall behind her home with a soot-marked sign that read "Loaves and Salt." I went there on market mornings, not at first. At first I walked by. Passed the door and paused a moment, listening to the rhythm of her hands kneading dough on the stone. The soft sound of flour dusting off the table. The creak of the oven as she checked the fire. The smell was what finally broke me. Warm bread and rosemary. I hadn't smelled anything like that since my mother died. It pulled something old from my ribs, so I stepped inside. She didn't look up at first, just nodded toward the row of loaves cooling on the windowsill. "Fresh, 2 copper," she said. I placed the coins, took one, meant to leave, then she glanced up and saw my face. She didn't flinch, didn't narrow her eyes, didn't avert her gaze like most townsfolk did, didn't reach for a child or press a hand to her chest like she'd touched something cursed. She just looked. Like I was another man with dirt on his boots and hunger in his belly. The second time I came, she asked my name. I hesitated, then said, "Ravan." She nodded. "Ravan," she repeated. "You don't eat the crusts, do you?" I blinked. "How did you?" "Left a trail of soft middles on the path," she said. Like a boy, we both laughed, quietly, like people learning how. It became routine after that, always early. Always 1 loaf. Sometimes she'd wrap it in cloth when it was cold outside. Sometimes she'd add a bit of salt on top before baking, just for me. One morning, I asked if she knew who I was. She said, "I know what you do, that's not the same." I asked if it bothered her. She shrugged. "The town eats, the town judges, but when they're sick or starving or scared, they find the nearest strong back. I don't see much difference between you and the butcher, except the butcher gets more thank yous." I didn't love her then, not yet, but I wanted to stand a little straighter that day. Weeks passed, seasons turned. I began lingering after buying bread. She began saving the crusts. We walked together once, down by the river. She picked up smooth stones and placed them in her pocket. "I like to keep things the water has already softened," she said. "It means time did the work." I told her about my garden, how I'd planted herbs in rows, kept bees in a broken pot hung from the wall. "You should bring me honey," she said. So I did. We married in winter, no ceremony, no crowd, just the priest, her apron still damp with dough and my hands awkward in new linen sleeves. I moved into her home. She insisted I keep the garden. Said a man needs something to tend that doesn't bleed. Our son came the following year. His name was Emil. He cried like thunder, kicked like a horse, and had his mother's dark eyes. When he laughed, oh, when he laughed, it was the sound of every reason I had ever needed to become someone better. I never told him what I did, not in words. He thought I worked for the town, like the mason or the night guard. He'd sit on my lap after supper, tracing the lines of my face with sticky fingers and asking, "Did you catch the bad ones today?" And I'd say, "No one bad today, just helped with the ropes." He nodded, satisfied, then asked for another story about the bees. Life became smaller, and in that smallness it became bearable. I learned the rhythm of love like I'd once learned the rhythm of the axe, slow, deliberate, reverent. Lyra would hum while she swept the flour across the hearth. I'd rest my head on her shoulder after the bread was done. We didn't speak of the gallows. We didn't speak of the garden at night when I burned the rags. We let love live in the corners, in the meals, in the way she warmed my hands with hers on cold mornings. I remember the first time I held Emil after a hanging. I had washed twice, scrubbed beneath the nails. Still, I felt the weight of it in my arms, the invisible echo of death trying to cling to me. But when I picked him up, he wrapped his arms around my neck, whispered something about birds flying above the chimney, and I felt something shift. Like maybe, just maybe, I could die with clean hands again, not because they were unstained, but because someone had held them anyway. We made a life, not grand but whole. Lyra taught Emil to count using raisins. I carved him a toy horse from a broken stool leg. On Sundays, we sat by the window and watched the town go about its business like we weren't the ones it watched in whispers. They never fully accepted me, but she did, and that was enough. There was a day I remember, more than any sentence I ever carried out. It was late spring. The sky was gold. Emil was playing in the yard with a wooden sword, shouting about dragons and heroes. Lyra sat on the stoop, shelling peas. I came home, laid my tools on the bench, and sat beside her. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I think the world is still worth saving," she said. I asked, "Because of bread and bees?" She smiled. "Because of mornings like this." And I believed her. For a time, I believed I could carry the weight. That love could build walls strong enough to keep out the echoes. That kindness could grow in even the bloodiest soil. But Rome and time have their own designs. There were harder years ahead, grimmer orders, faces that stayed with me too long. But that part of the story comes later. For now, remember this: there was a man once who had hands stained by duty and a wife who washed them in silence, who had a son who thought justice meant protecting the house from imaginary beasts, who planted mint for headaches and time for courage, who lit a candle each night not to keep the dark away, but to remember there was once warmth inside him. That was me. And some days I thought I might die with clean hands again. There comes a moment, quiet, barely perceptible, when the body obeys but the soul falters. That was the day my axe wavered. I'd always told myself I would know the signs of doubt, a tremble in the wrist, a hesitation at the shoulder, but the truth is, it's not the hand that hesitates first, it's the breath. And that morning I held it longer than I should have. Emil was 12 by then. Taller, sharper. He still asked me to check for monsters under the bed, but now he asked with a smile, not fear. He loved to watch birds through the window, sketching their feathers in charcoal on the back of old flour sacks. I kept everyone. He didn't know yet, didn't know what I was. The villagers did, and they had begun to whisper louder. I heard them in the alleys, the way children shout behind closed shutters. Some called me cursed. Others called me necessary, but none spoke to me directly unless they had to. Lyra bore it quietly, as she always had, but there were days when she returned from market with tight eyes and short words. I knew something had been said. I didn't press. We had learned to preserve peace by pretending it was whole. Then came the trial. A man named Halric, a thatcher from the West Fields, middle-aged, calloused, poor, accused of murdering the steward's brother in a dispute over grazing rights. The steward swore Halric had threatened violence. A servant claimed to have seen a struggle, but others, neighbors, even a priest, spoke for his kindness, his gentleness. He was convicted anyway. It wasn't justice, it was arithmetic, a balance of power. The steward's word weighed more than 10 villagers, more than the truth. I knew it, and I said nothing. Because it was not my place. That's what I told myself. That's what I'd always told myself. The morning of the execution was gray, not rainy, just dim, a sky the color of old wool. The kind of day that muffles sound, turns every footstep into a hush. Halric didn't protest, didn't cry, didn't rage against the heavens or curse the town that had condemned him. He stood calmly, looked at the crowd, then at me, and he bowed his head, as if offering it willingly. The priest finished the rites. The bailiff cleared his throat. I stepped forward. I placed a hand on his shoulder, not for control, but steadiness for both of us. He turned slightly, just enough to meet my gaze, and in that moment I saw it, not fear, not defiance, recognition. He looked at me as if I were the one being judged. As if he saw something inside me that I had spent years hiding behind black cloth and cold steel. As if he saw the weight. And for the first time in 2 decades, my grip faltered. The axe did not fall, not yet. It hovered mid-air, waiting on a breath I couldn't take. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for the crowd to shift, long enough for a guard to clear his throat, confused. Long enough for Halric to blink slowly and nod, as if to say it's all right, and so it fell, clean, final. Afterward, I walked away from the square alone. I did not return home. Instead, I walked beyond the fields, beyond the orchards, to the ruins of the old monastery, a place I hadn't visited in years. I sat beneath a crumbling arch and watched ants climb the mossy stones. I listened to the silence the dead leave behind. When I finally returned, Lyra met me at the door. She didn't speak, just looked at me, her eyes filled with a kind of understanding I hadn't earned. I bathed, changed my clothes, and sat at the table while Emil told me about the kestrel he'd seen in the barn that afternoon. I nodded, smiled, laughed in the right places, but I wasn't really there. I was still beneath that axe, caught between breath and blade. That night after they slept, I lit a candle and stared at my hands. I whispered Halric's name, not for forgiveness, but because someone needed to. The following days were heavier, my steps slower, my thoughts murkier. I began to wonder, what if I said no? What if I refused? I had always believed I had no right to such thoughts, that my role was chosen, shaped by circumstance and necessity. But Howrick's eyes haunted me. They saw a man, not an instrument, and once you've been seen, it's hard to disappear again. A week later, I visited his widow. I didn't speak, just left a basket at her door, bread, herbs, and a carving Emil had made of a bird with crooked wings. She never opened the door, but the next morning the basket was gone. I considered walking away from the job, truly considered it. I even wrote a letter to the magistrate. But I never sent it, because I was still afraid of what it would mean, how the town might respond, how Lyra and Emil might suffer the echoes of my rebellion. But something had changed. From that day on, I asked questions. I read the charges myself, looked into eyes, listened to voices, sought cracks in the stories. Sometimes I found them, sometimes I didn't, but I stopped pretending it didn't matter. At night, when the hearth was low and the house quiet, I would lie awake and hear my own breathing, slow, shallow, uncertain. And I would ask myself, what if I had stopped it? What if I had said no? The answers never came easily. Some nights I'd dream of Howrick, not in the square, not beneath the axe, but beside a stream, collecting reeds with his son. He'd look up, smile, and offer me a loaf of bread. I always woke before I could take it. Emil began asking more questions around that time. "Why do people look at you funny, father?" I said, "because they think I'm different." "Are you?" "I hope not," I said, but I didn't know. He asked if I believed in justice, and I said, "I believe in trying." The next execution was a thief, caught 3 times, never violent, just desperate. I petitioned the magistrate for mercy. He denied it, but the thief escaped the night before he was due to die. Some said I left his cell unlocked. I never confirmed it, I never denied it. But I slept better that night, not because the law had been broken, but because for once I had not broken with myself. I still performed my duties, still wore the robe, still stood in the square when called, but something had shifted in me. A balance, perhaps. Between the man and the mask, between the role and the soul. The axe still hung in its place above the door, still gleamed when oiled, still waited when needed, but it no longer ruled me. And one day I knew it would not be raised again, because even the steadiest hand may tremble when the heart no longer agrees, and I had seen my reflection in another man's eyes, and I could not unsee it. The first time I stepped into the chapel with the intention to speak, truly speak, it was just after harvest, the air heavy with smoke and cider. I had passed through that door 100 times before. Weddings, funerals, duties. All moments that asked me to appear, nod, bow, and then leave quietly. I always sat near the back, in the shade of the arch, where the incense never quite reached and the hymns grew faint. It felt right, somehow, that even in God's house I kept to the shadows. But that day I stepped forward, past the pews, past the candles and their flickering gold. The priest was young, too young, perhaps, for what I carried. He had a gentle face with a mouth shaped by more prayers than pain. His robes were clean, his eyes calm. I knelt before him. "Bless me, Father," I began, "for I have sinned." He made the sign of the cross, waited. "It has been," I hesitated. "I don't know how long, I've never truly confessed." He tilted his head, curious but not alarmed. I am the town's executioner." That word changed the air. He didn't flinch, but his hands stilled. I told him of Howrick, of the ones who looked me in the eye, of the ones who screamed, of the ones who didn't deserve it, of the ones who maybe did, but who still haunted my sleep. I spoke of rope burns on my palms, of the sound of a neck cracking like a tree limb in frost, of the way I'd once measured mercy in seconds rather than words, and then I fell silent, not because I was finished, but because the words hurt more than the deeds ever had. The priest waited, then spoke softly. "Have you left your post?" "No," I said, "but I've buried names in my chest until there's barely room for breath. I've tried to spare pain, tried to learn more than was ever asked of me, tried to see each face." He sighed, a sound that carried both sorrow and something else, caution. Then I cannot absolve you." "Not yet," I looked up. "Why?" "Because you still serve death." "But I want to serve peace now." He shook his head. "Peace must be chosen, not carried between tasks." His words weren't cruel, but they closed a door. I left quietly, didn't argue, didn't plead, but I didn't return to the chapel again. Instead, that night, I lit a single candle and sat at the table after Lyra and Emil had gone to bed. I took a clean scrap of parchment and wrote it all down, every name I remembered, every doubt, every time I'd hesitated, every time I hadn't. I wrote about Tomas, about the man who forgave me, about the boy who had watched me prepare rope and asked if I was building something. I wrote until the candle was nearly gone. Then I folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and walked to the hearth. It felt wrong to keep it, so I burned it, watched the edges curl, blacken, vanish. And in the ashes I saw something soft, not release, not redemption, but relief. A few days later I woke before dawn. The house was still. Even the birds had not begun their chatter. I dressed in silence, took the axe from the wall, wrapped it in cloth, and walked beyond the fields, beyond the road. To the oldest tree I knew, an ash, wide and gnarled, its roots coiled like old rope. I dug with my hands. The earth was damp, dark, welcoming. Each scoop of soil felt like an exhale, and when the hole was deep enough, I lowered the axe into it, unwrapped it gently, brushed my fingers along its edge one last time. It had been sharp for so long. Then I covered it, pressed the dirt down slowly as though tucking in a child. And I sat beside the mound, not in prayer, just in quiet. Somewhere behind me a twig snapped. I turned. A boy stood at the edge of the clearing. Maybe 6, maybe 7, thin arms, bare feet, watching. I didn't speak, neither did he. He looked at the tree, at the ground, at me. Then, slowly, he nodded and turned back the way he came. I sat there until the sun touched the tips of the leaves. When I returned home, Lyra didn't ask. She saw my empty hands, my raw palms. She simply poured me tea and kissed my temple. I held Emil that night longer than I should have. He wiggled, then settled. "Father," he said sleepily, "you smell like dirt." "I know," I whispered. "Good dirt." I dreamt of the axe again, but this time it did not gleam. It rusted, slowly, gently, as if it too were tired. The villagers noticed its absence. Some muttered, some speculated. One or two even smiled, but no one asked, not directly. They hired a boy from the city for the next sentence. He was nervous, his swing was too high. I watched from a distance and felt nothing. Only the breeze in the grass, only the weight that had once lived in my arms, now resting under roots. I still carry the memories, still see the eyes, still flinch at certain sounds, but I no longer serve death, not with my hands, not with my tools, and perhaps, in time, not even with my silence. When I placed the axe in the earth, it felt like placing part of myself in the ground, but not the worst part, just the tired part. It had been 7 years since I'd last held a blade for duty. 7 years since I'd buried the axe and told myself it was over. The villagers had stopped watching me so closely. Some even forgot, or pretended to. I had become what I'd always longed to be, just another man who bought bread, mended fences, and aged without spectacle. But peace, like bread in a time of famine, never lasts long. The year the rains failed, everything cracked, first the fields, then the patience of the people. Wheat turned brittle, barley grew thin, goats birthed still, chickens stopped laying, and hunger began to walk among us, hand in hand with rage. The riot began in the market square, not with torches or chants, but with a stolen apple. A young man, no older than my son, snatched it from a cart and ran. The merchant shouted, someone threw a stone, and then it spread like fire over dry straw. By sundown, the steward's house had been looted. A guard had been killed, throat cut, some said, others claimed trampled. Either way, he was dead, and someone had to answer for it. They caught a man the next day, Ephron, a barrel maker with wide shoulders and cracked hands. He had no knife on him, no blood, but he had a history of angry words and a face that could be painted as guilty. That was enough. They sentenced him by week's end, but the city hangman had fallen ill, or refused, no one would say. And so they came for me. They came quietly as they always had. A knock just before dawn, two officials, robes heavy with damp, eyes avoiding mine. "I don't do that anymore," I said. They glanced at each other. "It's a matter of justice," one muttered. "No," I said, "it's a matter of fear." There was silence. Then, if not you, then someone less careful. They knew me. Knew I wouldn't let a boy fresh off the road break a neck wrong or tighten the knot too loose, and I hated them for knowing it. Still, I said yes, because old instincts die slower than old men. I walked to the gallows in boots that didn't fit right anymore. My knees ached. My back was tight. Every step whispered, "You don't belong here." Ephraim stood waiting, shoulders squared, jaw clenched. He looked like a man braced for waves. I saw no fear in him, only endurance. A crowd had gathered, thin, tired faces drawn by anger or the need for distraction from their own emptiness. The priest rushed the right, voice barely above a whisper. The guards held Ephraim roughly. One spat at his boots. I inspected the rope. Thick, dry, already strained from age. I should have replaced it. I should have said something, but I didn't. I stood before Ephraim and looked him in the eye. "I don't know if you did it," I said softly. "I did not," he replied with quiet certainty. I believed him. That should have mattered more than it did. I slipped the noose over his head, tightened the knot, stepped back. The crowd hushed. Then the lever fell, and the rope snapped. It didn't fray. It didn't stretch. It broke. Clean, with a sound like thunder in a dry sky. Ephraim collapsed in a heap, stunned but unhurt. A moment of stillness passed. The world held its breath. And then chaos. Some screamed, some laughed. A few surged forward, guards drawing steel, shouts clashing in the air. In the confusion, Ephraim rolled, stood, ran. I saw a guard lift his bow, but a woman grabbed his arm. Another stepped in the way, and then Ephraim was gone, into the alleyways, into the smoke, into the city that had tried to kill him. They never found him. They said he vanished north. Others said he died of fever. Some whispered he joined a band of rebels, lived as a ghost in the woods. I never looked, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need to. In that moment, in the square, with the rope snapping like a rebuke from the earth itself, I understood. The world had spoken, not heaven. Not fate, but humanity. It said enough, and who was I to argue with mercy? That night I walked home slowly. The streets were strangely quiet, as though the city itself was holding back tears. Lyra met me at the door. She didn't ask. She saw it in my face, saw the rope burn on my palm where it had tried to hold on, saw the emptiness behind my eyes. I bathed in silence. The water cold, the basin cracked. Emil brought me tea without a word. Later, when they slept, I returned to the clearing beneath the ash tree. I dug with my hands again, slower this time. The dirt was thicker, more tangled with roots. I thought I might find the axe, long rusted, asleep, but I wasn't there for that. I took the broken rope and buried it instead, wrapped it in cloth, pressed it into the earth, covered it gently, as one buries something not evil but tired. I sat there until the moon reached its highest point, and I spoke aloud to the dirt, to the tree, to the rope. I will not come again. And I haven't. Ephraim became, for me, not a man, but a message. That even in places of judgment, the world could still surprise us, could still choose life, however briefly. I think of him sometimes when I walk the market with Lyra, or when Emil sketches birds from the rooftop. I wonder if Ephraim has a son, if he tells him stories of how close the edge can feel, how a rope can betray even the surest death. And how mercy, though rare, can arrive without warning. There are many things I regret, names I still whisper, eyes I still see. But that day, the day the rope snapped, I do not regret. It was the day the world reminded me that death is not always certain, that sometimes even the instruments of justice fail for a reason. And sometimes that failure is grace. The candle is low now. It trembles more than it burns. Its light stretches long shadows over the walls, shadows shaped like old hands, stooped shoulders, a rope coiled in the corner of memory. I have written much, more than I thought I had the strength to, but there is still this last part. The part no one asked me to write. I do not know your name. I do not know where you sit or lie as you listen. Perhaps you are far from my village. Perhaps you live in a world that forgot men like me ever existed. Perhaps you have never held a blade or felt the weight of a life in your grip. But I am writing to you, because the others, the priests, the judges, the barons, the kings, they already had my silence, my obedience. My hands, you have only my voice, that is what remains. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I have lived too long with the echoes of what I've done to believe it is owed to me. And truthfully, I no longer think forgiveness is something we are owed at all. It is something given if we are lucky, if we are seen, if we are remembered. No, this is not a pardon, only a prayer. A prayer that this story, bitter and bent as it may be, might sit with you for a while. Might breathe quietly beside you as you drift, might settle like dust on your shelves, small but persistent, a whisper among all the noise. There were nights I thought I'd never be anything but the hand that ends, but even a hand can tremble, even a blade can rust, even a rope can snap. These I have learned. There were moments, rare but real, when I glimpsed myself not as the world saw me, but as I might have been. Holding my son as he slept, his breath light as feathers against my chest. Listening to Lyra hum as she folded linen, the sun spilling across the floor. Digging in the garden while the sparrows scolded me from the hedge. And I wondered in those moments whether redemption might be made of these small things, not grand gestures, not absolution, just gentleness, offered quietly again and again. If you have never done harm, truly, intentionally, then I hope this story reminds you to never begin. If you have and carry the weight of it, then I hope it reminds you that memory can be a form of mourning. That regret, if held gently, can bloom into something softer than shame. I hope you never stand in a square and wonder if the face staring back at you is your own. I hope you never learn the names of the dead by how their mothers cry. And if you do, if, like me, you find yourself walking in the hush between duty and doubt, I hope you pause. Just pause. Long enough to remember that every life ends, but not every life must be taken. There were boys who tried to become like me. I saw it in their eyes, lit with the flicker of fear and admiration. They thought precision was strength, that control was honor, but they never saw the hands after. Never saw the shaking, or the way I folded my own name away again and again until it no longer felt like mine. I was called many things: the quiet axe, the steady rope, the king's last word. But the name I miss most is the one my son used before he learned what I had done. Father, he still uses it. But now it sounds like something forgiven, not forgotten. My days are few now. My legs ache with the climb to the door. My eyes blur at dusk. I sleep less. I dream more. Sometimes I dream of Tomas, the man who forgave me without permission. Sometimes I dream of Ephron, running into the alley, the world deciding that death had no place that day. But mostly I dream of the rope, frayed, slack, buried. I do not believe in saints, but I believe in silence, the kind that follows a hard truth. The kind that sits beside someone, saying nothing and yet offering everything. If this voice found you in the dark, maybe it was meant to. Maybe you needed to hear that even those shaped by cruelty can long for peace. Maybe you too have buried something. Maybe you too wait for the rope to break, or the axe to stay, or the priest to listen, or the world to say enough. If so, then I hope you find the strength to lay your burdens down gently, one by one, like kindling no longer needed. And if not now, then soon. Soon enough. Thank you for listening, for letting me speak this one last time. Not to be remembered, not to be praised, but simply to be heard. If you want to hear more forgotten lives like mine, whispered gently back into the world, subscribe, stay, and rest. May your night be long, may your heart be light, and may no blade ever find your shadow. Good night.